Have you ever wondered if railroads hold more than just transport routes? What if night trains, empty carriages, and abandoned stations are doors to another world where something inexplicable lurks? Something that hunts precisely at those moments when you're alone on the platform and the last train has already left. Get ready to hear 3 stories that will keep you awake tonight. You will never look at railroads the same way again. Watch until the end if you want to know the truth. Story 1: Jack and the Ghost Train. Jack was just an ordinary college student. He studied, hung out with friends, and worked part-time in the evenings. One such evening he had to stay at work later than usual. The last train to his home left at midnight, and Jack managed to jump on it in the very last seconds. The train was almost empty, typical for late-night trains. Jack sat by the window, stretched his legs, and closed his eyes, trying to relax. The train moved at its usual speed, but after a few stops, Jack suddenly felt a slight unease. Something was off. He opened his eyes and saw a man boarding the carriage. The man was dressed in an old, worn-out coat. He sat at the far end of the carriage, not looking around like most passengers do. His gaze was fixed straight ahead, and this gave Jack an odd sense of discomfort. Soon, the train slowed down and unexpectedly stopped in the middle of the tracks. Outside, there was nothing but darkness, and a voice came over the speaker: technical issues. Please await further instructions. There were no signs of life around, no city lights, no buildings, just endless darkness outside and the strange man sitting at the end of the carriage. Jack tried to convince himself that everything was fine, that it was just a random stop, but a voice inside told him something wasn't right, and he was correct. Suddenly, the lights in the carriage went out. For a few seconds, there was complete darkness, and Jack heard the sound of footsteps, but these footsteps were unnaturally quiet, as if made by someone not entirely real. When the lights flickered back on, the man was closer to him. His face remained emotionless, but there was something entirely inhuman in his eyes. Jack quickly stood up and headed for the door to the next carriage, but the doors were locked. He tugged at the handle, but it wouldn't budge. Jack couldn't understand why this was happening. Suddenly, the lights went out again. In the pitch-black darkness, Jack felt something touch his shoulder. He jumped back in fright, but then the lights came back on, and the man was standing right in front of him. Jack screamed and tried to run to the other end of the carriage, but his legs wouldn't move. It was as if they were paralyzed. He felt a coldness radiating from this strange being. Soon the train started moving again, but instead of feeling relief, Jack's fear only intensified. The voice on the speaker sounded again, but this time it said something different: "You're not leaving." Jack froze, panic flooding his mind. He turned around, the man was gone, but the feeling of his presence lingered. When the train finally reached the next station, the doors suddenly opened. Jack dashed out onto the platform without looking back. But when he turned around, the train was gone. No lights, no sound of the departing train, just silence. Later, Jack learned that this train had disappeared from the route several years ago. He never took a night train again. Story 2: Megan and the Strange Passenger. Megan often took night trains home after work. This time, the train looked the same as always: old seats, dim lights, the smell of worn-out fabric and dust. She sat in her usual spot by the window and took out her phone to pass the time until she got home. But after a few stops, her attention was drawn to a man who boarded at one of the small rural stations. He was in his 40s, wearing a long gray coat. He sat across from her and immediately began staring directly into her eyes. Megan tried to ignore his gaze, but she couldn't shake the uneasy feeling it gave her. She decided it would be best to move to another carriage. But as soon as she stood up, the man rose too. This was too strange. She quickly walked toward the exit of the carriage, and to her horror, the man followed her. Megan quickened her pace, trying to escape to the next carriage. Her heart pounded faster as she realized he was still watching her. She entered the next carriage, but it was completely empty. She turned around and saw that the man was halfway toward her. He moved slowly, but his gaze was fixed on her, as if he were focused on nothing else. She rushed to the door, but all the doors were locked. Panic grew as the lights started flickering. The man was getting closer. Just then, the train braked sharply, and Megan fell to the floor. She struggled to get up, but the man had disappeared. Looking around, she realized she was completely alone. Suddenly, the lights in the carriage went out for good, and in the pitch-black darkness, Megan heard strange sounds like whispers. The whispers came from all directions, and she felt as if someone was walking around her. She couldn't understand what was happening, but the fear had already taken full control of her. Suddenly, she felt a cold hand on her shoulder. Her body froze with terror as she turned around, but no one was there. Megan rushed to the door and tried to open it, but it wouldn't budge. The carriage grew colder, and she felt as though something invisible was getting closer with each passing second. The lights flickered again, and in that brief moment, she saw a shadow in the corner of the carriage. The shadow slowly moved toward her. Megan stood frozen, unable to move. She heard a strange hum growing louder around her, like the sound of distant train tracks but muffled. The shadow was almost upon her when the doors to the carriage suddenly opened. Megan dashed onto the platform without looking back. At that moment, the lights in the carriage flickered on again, and she saw that the train was empty. She tried to make sense of what had happened, but her mind refused to believe it was real. Story 3: Tom and the Abandoned Station. Tom had worked on the railroad for many years and was an experienced technician. One night, he was assigned to inspect an abandoned station that had long been out of use, but was still part of the active line. This place was known for its eerie atmosphere, and many workers avoided shifts there. Tom, however, was a skeptic and didn't believe in ghost stories or the supernatural. He was convinced it was all just make-believe, but that night, his confidence was about to be tested. Tom arrived at the abandoned station. All around him was silence, except for the faint rustling of the wind blowing across the tracks. The station looked as if it had been abandoned in a hurry. Old posters still hung on the walls, and a broken clock had stopped at some long-forgotten time. He pulled out his flashlight and began inspecting the rails. Everything seemed normal, no signs of damage or wear. But as he continued his inspection, he couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching him. Several times he glanced over his shoulder, but of course there was no one there. The only sounds were his own footsteps on the gravel. Tom forced himself to ignore his feelings and carried on with his work. After a while, he approached a tunnel old and ominous. This tunnel hadn't been in use for years, but it was part of his inspection route. The tunnel was creepy. The walls were covered in thick grime, parts of the ceiling had caved in, and inside it was as dark as a cave. Tom turned his flashlight to full power and headed inside. At first, everything seemed fine. The light illuminated the tracks, and nothing seemed out of the ordinary. But then, suddenly the flashlight began to flicker. Tom stopped tapping the light to stabilize it, and at that moment he heard a strange noise. It sounded like faint footsteps echoing from deep within the tunnel. Tom stopped and listened. The footsteps were unmistakable, slow but heavy, and they were getting louder, as if someone was heading straight toward him. That can't be, Tom thought. No one else should be at the station. But the sound grew closer, and each step reverberated louder in his head. A chill ran down his spine. Logically, he knew it could be an echo of his own steps, but his legs weren't moving, and the sound kept getting closer. Tom decided to turn back, but the flashlight flickered again, and when it came back on, a shadow appeared in front of him. At first, it looked like a person, but as the figure moved closer, its shape became more unnatural. The creature was tall, with a hunched back, its movements jerky as if someone was controlling it from afar. But the most terrifying part was its eyes. They glowed bright yellow, cutting through the darkness. It moved toward Tom slowly, but with purpose, as if it knew he couldn't escape. Tom couldn't move. He stood frozen, paralyzed with fear. The creature stopped just a few feet away, staring at him. Its glowing eyes reflected in the tunnel, and it felt like they were piercing into his soul. Tom took a step back, and that movement seemed to break the spell. The creature suddenly lunged at him with inhuman speed. Tom barely managed to dodge and ran for the exit. His legs were shaky, and he ran as fast as he could, but the sense of the creature chasing him never left. He could hear it scraping against the tunnel walls, making a metallic sound that only spurred him on faster. When Tom finally reached the platform, he stopped abruptly and looked back. The tunnel was empty, but his flashlight was still flickering. He gasped for air, trying to process what had just happened. It seemed like it was all just his imagination, but when he looked again into the tunnel, he saw those same yellow eyes glowing in the darkness. Tom raced back to his post. He wanted to call for help, but the station's communication system wasn't working. There was only one thought left: he had to get out of there as quickly as possible. Tom headed for the service shed to collect his things and leave the station. But when he opened the door, his heart sank. Fresh footprints were on the floor. Someone had already been there, and the tracks led straight to the tunnel. He realized in horror that he wasn't alone. Fear gripped him, but he couldn't stay there any longer. Tom grabbed his equipment and fled the station. When he reached the nearest town, his co-workers were already waiting for him. They asked what had happened, but Tom just shook his head. He knew no one would believe him. Tom never returned to that station again. His co-workers claimed that they saw him completely changed. He was no longer the cheerful, skeptical man they once knew. Every night when he closed his eyes, he saw those yellow eyes glowing in the darkness. And though he tried to forget that night, the creature from the tunnel continued to haunt him in his nightmares. If you enjoyed these terrifying stories and want to discover even more chilling secrets, subscribe to our channel and hit the like button. Let us know in the comments which story you found the scariest. If we reach 100 likes, new videos will come out more often.